My guest today is an old friend of mine, Joe Cirincione. Joe is currently a distinguished fellow at the Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft in Washington, D.C. He worked for 9 years in the U.S. House of Representatives on the Armed Services Committee and the Committee on Government Operations. He served for over 12 years as the president of the Plowshares Fund, a public grant-making foundation focused on nuclear nonproliferation and conflict resolution. He previously served as Vice President for National Security and International Policy at the Center for American Progress in Washington, D.C. He was also the Director for Nonproliferation at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. A couple of his books were Bomb Scare, The History and Future of Nuclear Weapons, and also Deadly Arsenals, Nuclear, Biological, and Chemical Threats. Joe, thank you very, very much for being with me.
Well, thank you very much for having me on. It's a pleasure to talk with you and to see you again.
Thank you. You know, as I mentioned to you before we came on, my original thought had been, I want Joe to come on so we can have an entire podcast about nuclear issues. But then I saw you on television talking to, I think it was Lawrence O'Donnell. Yeah. About Afghanistan. And of course, I've been doing a series of reflections on Afghanistan. So I'm really grateful to you, so that we can have an opportunity to talk about that. First of all, give me a little thumbnail sketch of how you see the situation, and what you think about the decision to leave, how we left, and where you think it leaves us and the Afghan people today.
Well, as Admiral Mike Mullins, the former chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, recently said, we should have left 10 years ago. You know, we could have left in 2010 after we had accomplished our initial mission, which was to hunt down Osama bin Laden, the man who attacked us, and disrupt the operations of al-Qaeda. We did that. But then we stayed, and we turned it into a nation-building exercise, as some call it. But for some, this was really about establishing a major military presence in the Middle East. Afghanistan was one part of the board for them. Iraq was the other. Syria, Libya, Yemen. For some, this was all about projecting American military power deep into the Middle East and then deep into Asia, using the Middle East as a springboard. This was a terrible idea from the beginning. I was against the war in Iraq back in 2003. I was against staying in Afghanistan. And I was delighted to see President Biden finally have the courage to end this war. And in his speech announcing the end of the war, to say that it was the beginning of a process, a turning of the page, he said, where we would turn away from 20 years of major military interventions. Now the task for Biden is to stick to it. Because I got to tell you, you're here in Washington, you understand, this town does not want to end these wars. This town does not want to turn the page. So we're at the beginning of a major policy struggle on this issue central to the national security of the United States.
Well, I'm glad that we're able to have the conversation, because this is the time when it's so important for that establishment to know that this time the American people are watching and we're thinking, and we're not going to be quiet. First of all, I want to go back to an effort to bust this myth that we were doing any nation building. As Sarah Chase, who wrote the very good article, The Ides of August, said, what nation building did we do? We established a puppet government. We enabled and supported and established originally a puppet government which was not democratic. So how can we talk about nation building when we are not even establishing a democratic government or supporting democratic processes? So they use this cover of nation building. I see very little nation building. And what nation building I do see, correct me if I'm wrong, had to do with NGOs, had to do with private interests, such as development of television stations, radio stations, etc. So I don't think that we should let those guys get away with this myth that we were staying to do some nation building. Because if they were doing some nation building, maybe that would have been a good thing.
That's a very, very good point. You know, and I'm old enough to have protested the war in Vietnam and to have seen the kind of puppet governments we put in place there, calling it democracy. And when you do an effort like this, there is certainly some good that is accomplished. There is a lot of well-meaning people who are trying to do good. And so you saw a lot of NGOs go in and do some very serious and very credible humanitarian work, especially with women and young girls. We saw that. But the problem is it's taking place in this artificial construct, as you say, a puppet government with it completely corrupt, all right, very unpopular, very undemocratic. The election that left the last president in place was highly contested. He was believed to have stolen the election, basically, stuffed the ballot box. And then he stuffed suitcases full of cash and fled the country. So when you think about the very messy end of this misadventure, why did the Afghan security forces crumble? A big part of the reason is their president left town in the middle of the night in a convoy of cars, stealing $164 million from the government and fled with this entourage to Qatar. At that point, what are you fighting for? Why should any Afghan soldier die for a government that had just collapsed? That demonstrated the shallowness, the artificiality of the entire process. That's what caused the collapse of the Afghan government, the Afghan security forces, more than the U.S. pullout. It was the pullout of the president and his entire cabinet.
Well, there's a lot that you said there for us to deconstruct. First of all, you talk about the artificial construct. Yes, it was an artificial construct. But as you also mentioned, a lot of good was done despite the terrible faults and the mistakes that we made. And for those people, particularly young people, the average age is 18 years and younger. Those lives where people did get a taste of freedom, however corrupt the government was not for them an artificial construct. And I think that the fact that you acknowledged and others have acknowledged that this is not simple, that there are so many complicated layers of things, is important from a humanitarian perspective. There were people who got a taste of some things over the last 20 years that they did not have previous and that unfortunately they are not having today. Now, as far as the corruption of the government is concerned, that did not start with Ghani. Hamid Karzai was part of the Pakistani group that originally established the Taliban, as we know. So from the very beginning, with Karzai, it's not just that we stood by and enabled a corrupt government. And this is the question I have for you as someone who knows as much as you do, who knows as much as you do about Pakistan, knows as much as you do about nuclear issues. There must be some reason. I know that our CIA was very close to military intelligence in Pakistan. What was really going on there? And also, I want to ask you something else. In fact, why don't we take this first? Robert McNamara famously said towards the end of his life that we didn't know anything about the Vietnamese people. We didn't know anything about their religion, their history, their culture. He said we didn't have anyone to teach us. That last line has always bothered me because he could have found someone to teach them if they had wanted to. But it seems to me that the hubris, the arrogance, the disconnection from the culture of the Vietnamese people is one of the worst aspects of the American behavior that was replicated in Afghanistan. Almost a contempt for the Afghan people, when in fact we were the ones who were bringing in such corrupt elements. The warlords, the Afghan people, had hated the warlords, initially had even been grateful to see the Taliban get rid of the warlords, and yet when we came in, we put the warlords back in power. So I'd like to hear your thoughts about all of those things.
When you see these kinds of patterns repeating over years, you would think we would learn from them. And I think two basic things were going on. Number one, we didn't listen to the people of Afghanistan. We didn't listen to what they wanted. And we tried to impose an American construct, a centralized government. Well, the last time Afghanistan had a centralized government that lasted was when the Greeks invaded around 350 BC and stayed for about 150 years. That was the last time there was a sustained central government. This is not the culture, the experience of the Afghan people.
But not just that. If I may, it wasn't it's not just that it was a centralized government. It wasn't even a democratic centralized government.
Right. I mean, I think you could make the argument that the initial election was fairly democratic. But even then, by then you already had billions of dollars of U.S. assistance flowing in to Afghans who were connected, Afghans who the contractors would bring on to help them implement their projects. And when that kind of money just starts to flow into a country with very little oversight going on, very few checks and balances, well, this is the kind of corruption you're going to get, building on the culture of the country, but just exacerbating it, making it much worse. The second big mistake, I think, was thinking that the urban centers were the true Afghanistan. And, Kabul has a population of some 6 million people. That's a big chunk of the country. But about 70% of the population of Afghanistan lives in the rural areas. And for those people, their experience with the 20 years of occupation that we had there was not one of democracy and change and social transformation. It was war. It was killing. It was just constant destruction, fighting back and forth, either between the warlords or between the Afghan forces and the forces of the Taliban. So as it turns out, we now realize that the rural population of Afghanistan couldn't wait to get the United States out. They wanted an end to this war, and they were more comfortable with the kind of security that the Taliban provided than the kind of security the Afghan police force and the Afghan military was saying, as they said, we'll pay a tax to the Taliban, but we won't be stopped every few miles on the road and asked for a bribe from the security forces or the police forces that were there. So those kind of two basic problems, I think. Oh, and finally, here's the third, is the way we constructed the Afghan military was, again, a U.S. model, high tech, highly dependent on contractors, right? Now, look at when you saw the Taliban enter Kabul, what did they enter in? Toyota pickups with Kalashnikovs. There was no air cover. There was no complex armored vehicles that requires very sophisticated maintenance. You could see a very different kind of warfare, a kind of warfare that succeeded. So in a large extent, this was not a military defeat as much as it was a political defeat for the United States and the unpopular government we tried to impose on the country.
The Afghan people are historically known to be among the best guerrilla fighters in the world. So if you're going to build an Afghan army, you'd think it would be with some respect for the traditions, the military traditions of the Afghan people. But of course, where's the money to be made for the military-industrial complex if you do that? These are the kinds of things that we are beginning to understand.
So, one of the things that's coming out in our as people begin to look at not just what happened over the last 20 days, but what happened over the last 20 years, is we're starting to understand finally where the money went. There's a couple of very good articles today. And my colleague at the Quincy Institute, Eli Clifton, just tweeted out a study that talked about the fact that we spent about $2.3 trillion, $2.3 trillion in this war. $2 trillion of it went directly to U.S. contractors. So while this was a horrible war for many people, some people got very rich off of this war. The contractor stocks went through the roof. Their profits increased. There was a 1,500% return on their stock prices during these 20 years. So there was a lot of profits were made in this war, selling the kinds of products that the U.S. government would buy, but not what the Afghan people actually needed.
War profiteering used to be considered a crime. Now it's an industry. And of course, also, when they come around and say, hey, you guys need this new equipment, and they say, well, what are we going to do with the old equipment? They say, send it to the boys back home, which is how we got these highly militarized domestic police forces in the United States, which are hardly what we need. Okay, now, the president had said in his speech that we were spending something like $300 million a day. He's also very well known for having opposed the surge that Obama ordered in 2010. Biden is pretty much on record as having been deeply suspicious of this war for quite a while. There's a well-known story of his having had dinner with Karzai. Walking out, he was so disgusted by something Karzai said, he was definitely clear about the corruption. Now, when he decided that we would leave, and I think there is universal approval of the basic decision to leave. Like you said, Mullen said we could have left in 2010. seems to me we might have been able to leave 2004, 2003, 2005. I don't know.
I
Mullen
agree,
would know
yes.
more about that. Yeah. Okay. Now, but the president, even though he said, as you have mentioned, and I want to hear more about that, he said we need to turn the page on how we see national security. But at the same time, Joe, it was only within a few days that another $25 billion amendment was passed, granting that to the military-industrial complex, to the defense budget. What are your thoughts about that?
Yeah. Let me just be, I have lots of thoughts about that, but let me just talk about your point that this is a popular decision. Just a few days ago, there was a new Washington Post ABC poll that showed that 77% of the American people approve of the withdrawal. This is after the chaotic nature of the initial days of that withdrawal. This is after 2 weeks of being hammered by the national media on the problems with the withdrawal. 77% approve of it, including 74% of Republicans, 76% of independents, and 84% of Democrats. So this is an extremely popular decision. You wouldn't know that if you just listened to the talking heads in Washington, D.C. I would think that it's a completely reverse. I think 74% of the pundits in Washington disapprove of the decision. They're more interested in protecting their own reputations and their privileges than they are in looking at what really went on with this war and why they were so wrong over all these years.
They weren't the only ones who...
Go ahead.
Hold on one moment. First of all, they were not the only ones who were wrong. Our civilian leadership is, to me, equally culpable in what occurred here. But I also want to say something else about that poll. The American people are able to walk and chew gum at the same time. The fact that there is overwhelming approval of the decision to leave does not mean that the American people are not horrified by that evacuation. And I personally have a lot of problems with Biden calling it an extraordinary success. It was not an extraordinary success, Joe. Women who were the most vulnerable, women who are on the kill lists of the Taliban, who we knew would be most vulnerable, were not prioritized for evacuation. And if you talk to the humanitarian groups, particularly humanitarian groups working with women, you hear of one tragedy after another, including those students who sat on the runway for 7 hours from the American University, and then were told that they would not be able to leave. So the fact that they took the military out first, to me, is a terrible black mark on America. You can be, because I know I am and many people are, approving of the decision to leave and equally horrified and ashamed of the way we left.
Yes, there was a lot of mistakes there. I think, we'll be investigating this. The Senate of the United States is finally going to have a hearing on Afghanistan after years of ignoring the war. They're going to concentrate on the withdrawal process. They're bringing Secretary of State Tony Blinken up to talk about it. I believe that the administration made a mistake in believing the military. The military told the president and the National Security Council that the government of Afghanistan would survive for months. The estimate was 3 months to 18 months. And so they thought they would have more time to do this planning and could do it. That was one of their big mistakes. I know, but even...
You're more charitable to those guys than I am. We'll talk, but go on.
Okay. But once they realized what a mess they had in their hand, I do believe they did a remarkable job on getting them out, and they're still trying to keep it open. Here's the interesting point. The doors are not closed yet. The administration is making a major diplomatic effort to work with the Taliban, with the people who won the war, to keep it open, to get people out. That's going to be extremely difficult, but so far, it's only been a week, we haven't seen the kind of horrors that we thought we might start getting, mass killings, roundups, some terrible things happening, but the door is still open. People are still leaving. So the story is still being written on this.
First of all, Joe, I think one of the reasons they finally woke up and stepped up and did, at that point, perform some real miracles trying to get people out was because of the public outcry. Mm-hmm. Before that, there was apparently no real plan. I mean, there was, once again, taking the military out first means that you have no real plan. And I have heard enough stories from enough humanitarian, particularly women's organizations, to know that it's very clear they did not prioritize the most vulnerable women, who we would have known would be in great danger. And we have heard stories. There was a story the other day about the 6-month pregnant female police officer murdered in front of her family. We know that the Taliban had a kill list of women. So yes, and they're saying they're going to be better this time. The announcement made today about the interim government does not give one a lot of hope, because it is the hardliners.
That's true.
It is the hardliners. Just one thing before we go on, because I certainly want to hear you talk about Pakistan. When you said that the civilian leaders were lied to by the military, first of all, George Washington, James Madison, Thomas Jefferson, etc., gave these guys every constitutional authority that they needed to do this right. Not only civilian leadership. I remember George Bush early on saying, I went in there and I asked the generals, do you have everything you need? And I thought, what is this? What do you mean you ask the generals do they have everything they need? It's supposed to be generals, tell me everything you want to do and I'll tell you whether or not I want you to do it. That's number one. Number two, I know you worked on the U.S. House of Representatives on the Armed Services Committee. Where were these guys? Where were these guys? Where was the congressional oversight? What did they do beyond asking generals to come in, ask them some questions, say, thank you, generals, for coming in here and sharing this information with us? Was no one looking? Was no one thinking? And I understand that they didn't I do understand this. I know that Biden, certainly, I'm told the highest of the officials to have discussed about the corruption of the government. But if your government is corrupt, maybe we could have done something to try to change that. So I understand that we're all lumping it on the military right now, but I think that's a little bit of a way for the Obamas of the world and the senators of the world and the congressional people of the world not to have to say, hey, maybe we should have been looking.
Well, that's exactly right. And that's why I think you're seeing all the discussion in Washington be about the withdrawal and not about the last 20 years. Because there's a major CYA effort going on. Cover your butt conversation going on.
It's so obvious.
And you're right. You could go back and look at these hearings, and the generals come up and would say everything's fine. We're turning the corner. And what they really meant is we're going in circles. And the chairs of the committee members would all nod their heads and go, well, and they say, do you have everything you need? Exactly. Congress has basically abandoned its oversight responsibility over the Pentagon right now and over this militarized foreign policy. And they've been doing it under Democrats. They've been doing it under Republicans.
Absolutely.
Republicans think it's good politics to go forward and present the image of a strong Republican Party that's backing the generals. And the Democrats themselves are afraid of national security. They don't want to touch this. They think of it as a weakness, as a distraction from their domestic agenda. So you had 20 years during this global war on terrorism of basically Congress just writing a blank check for the military for everything they need. When Biden says he wants to turn the page, so far that's just talk. Afghanistan is the first real step he's done, but as you point out, he's coupled it with endorsing the last Trump military budget. So he took Trump's budget and instead of cutting it, gave it a cost of living increase and gave it a bigger budget. And then the Senate Armed Services Committee and now the House Armed Services Committee, led by Democrats, have thrown another $25 billion on the pot.
Thank you.
Right?
Exactly. So
we now have the largest military budget that we've had in the United States since the end of World War II, with the one exception of the year right after the Iraq invasion. So it's bigger than during the Korean War, bigger than during the Vietnam War, bigger than during the Reagan buildup. It is an enormous military budget. And even though we're leaving Afghanistan and ending a war, it is growing. It is obscene what's going on in Washington.
Thank you for saying it. It seems obvious to us normal people outside. It's like, how do you say we're turning a page on the way we view national security, and then literally days later add another $25 billion to your defense budget? So,
so President Biden says he wants to reimagine national security. And when Jake Sullivan was introduced last November as his national security advisor, he said the president has tasked us with reimagining national security to include, as national security, climate change, pandemics, racial injustice, income inequity, attacks on democracy. They're right about this. And there's a lot of good work being done at academic institutions in the NGO world saying, yes, now's the time. We have to rethink what really threatens us. Look at what's happened with the pandemic, the biggest national security threat we faced in years. It's not Al-Qaeda that's the biggest threat. It's what's happening on climate, on pandemics, on nuclear weapons, etc. But he hasn't done it yet. Afghanistan is one step. Is he going to do anything else? Is he going to cut the budget? Is he going to shrink the number of nuclear weapons? Is he going to pull back from Iraq? Is he going to get pressure Saudi Arabia to end the war on Yemen? These are the big debates that we should be having. We haven't yet engaged in them.
I'm a little cynical compared to you these days, my friend. So let's go back a little bit.
Okay,
Jake Sullivan is one of the guys from the Obama administration. It's the same crowd. Biden is surrounded, even though Biden was a lone voice, and we do know that, with his known cynicism about what was happening during the Obama administration. He's now surrounded by the same group of people, including Mr. Sullivan. So when he says that the president has asked us to reimagine national security to include climate issues. Now, first of all, the Defense Department is the largest polluter out there. So if you want to say that you want to reconceive national security and include in that fighting climate change, you do that by giving $25 billion more to the Defense Department. Mm-hmm. So I'm just watching this. I'm sorry. This is the manipulation and the gaslighting. Oh, don't look over here that we're giving them $25 billion more. Say, but we are reconceiving national security. If you're reconceiving national security to include things like racial injustice, which is reasonable, or, climate change and mitigation, which is reasonable, why would you do that by giving more money to the Defense Department?
Here's where I agree with you. I believe I disagree with you on the sincerity of the national security team. Here's where I agree with you. Here's where we may have a different point of view on this. I think that Biden and the national security team are sincere, that they want to do this. I don't think they have a chance in hell of doing this without making some very, very difficult decisions on the budget, on support for the Saudis, some of our allies, on our relationship with Israel. These are going to be extremely difficult political decisions. And the culture in Washington is allied completely against them, in part because a lot of these governments, the Saudis, the Israelis, and others, have spent a lot of time and a lot of money shoring up domestic support for their agenda. The defense contractors have flooded the think tanks with grants. There's a reason you don't see Brookings and CSIS and the Center for New American Security, or even the Carnegie Endowment, where I used to work for many years, issuing reports critical of our national security strategy, that they themselves have a conflict of interest here. This town has been corrupted by 20 years of the global war on terrorism and the kinds of money that's flowed through the town. So therefore, I think it's our job, and you're doing it. And I wish there were more like you to speak up about this, to say we have to cut the budget. We have to turn this around. We have to make the president do what he says he wants to do.
Okay, I want to ask you about two things. I want to ask you about Pakistan. I want to ask you about China, which I think is also a part of the conversation that you just started. So Pakistan. We were giving about $1 billion a year in military assistance to Pakistan. At the same time, we know that Pakistan was giving military assistance to the Taliban, which makes it reasonable to assume that there were American soldiers who were killed by military equipment that we ourselves had given to Pakistan. Would you please explain this to me?
This is one of the great blunders of this war. We were basically funding both sides of this war. So the Pakistan government was the chief ally of the Taliban. They gave them safe haven in Pakistan for their own domestic reasons. There's a Pakistani Taliban, and they wanted the Pakistan government's approach to this is basically to buy them off and to stop them from waging attacks against the Pakistan government. And Pakistan is concerned about being surrounded by foes. They were not fans of the Afghan government. They thought that India and Iran had too much that India had too much influence in that government, and they wanted the Taliban as sort of a check on India, and we didn't do anything about it. to my knowledge, there was never any serious pressure on Pakistan to end its support for Taliban. Some consultations, some words, but we never cut a dime of assistance to Pakistan because of this. It was one of the greatest blunders of the war.
So you just said that the United States government was funding both sides. How can you call that a blunder and not a crime?
A crime, you mean like treason, like betrayal of the national security of the United States?
Oh, how about start even with the soldiers who were out there bravely fighting?
Yeah. One of the lessons of
somebody's got to hold these people accountable.
Right.
Right. If this is all going to
There's been no serious hearings. Go ahead.
If this is just going to be a bunch of polite conversations and we're going to look into what happened as opposed to someone being held accountable, it's just going to be the same thing that America always does, whether it has to do with a financial meltdown or a war. Hey, sorry guys, we really should have done that better. And they go forward and they pretty much do the same thing in time.
I would say right now, there's all the arrows are pointing towards a cover-up of our failures, a denial of our failures, rather than a true investigation. 2 years ago, Craig Whitlock at the Washington Post published the Afghanistan papers. These were documents that the Special Inspector General for Afghanistan had delivered, interviews with key military and civilian leaders in the effort that showed that they themselves knew that we were losing this war. That as far back as 2010, you had the commanders saying, we don't know what we're doing there. We are not improving the economy unless you count the opium production as part of the economy, which is better now than it was before we invaded. So they knew this. It was in the front pages of the Washington Post for 2 weeks. He ran special issues on this. Congress never convened a hearing. Never looked at it in any seriousness. Now they want to talk about the withdrawal, which they should. I would say the odds are that we will get 1 or 2 hearings on the Afghan war, and then that'll be it. They'll move over. They want to put it in the past because they're complicit in it. They're complicit. Congress is complicit in this failure, and they just don't want to talk about it anymore unless we make them.
Absolutely. And the reason we made them with the evacuation is because the American people are decent. We don't like to see people suffer. It takes a lot to get our attention. But that evacuation put so much unnecessary suffering, caused at least indirectly by the policies of the United States, right in our face. And that is what has happened with war. That started the day that Clinton said we can't show the returning coffins. As soon as they started doing various things, both domestically and internationally, to peripheralize the images of human suffering caused by our policies, it became much easier to distract the American people. Because when we see something like that, we don't like it. And that's, of course, why we're having this conversation, because it's incumbent upon all of us to not let this conversation die. You can see it already, Joe. The news programs are already starting to focus elsewhere, not put as much coverage in front of us. And if we do not work to stay awake to this, we will just go back to sleep. And that somnambulance is deadly for other people in the world in cases like this, and ultimately to us.
Last year, the nightly news broadcast of NBC, ABC, and CBS devoted a total of 5 minutes to the war in Afghanistan.
I read that.
All of last year. Now, remember, we had the pandemic. We had a lot of everything. But that is outrageous when you think about it. So the problem goes even deeper than the Congress, the military-industrial complex. It's how the media covers these things, what kind of stories they're interested in, what they think will catch people's attention and therefore lead to improved advertising rates, etc. We have a lot of things we have to work on to change in order to get to the point where we can really reimagine national security.
And I don't think we should forget that it was still the role of the commander-in-chief, the civilian commander-in-chief, to ask much deeper questions than obviously he was asking. Their whole idea of fighting a war is you apply ferocious forms of brute force. And if that's not working, apply more ferocious forms of brute force. And if that's not working, apply more ferocious forms of brute force. They know how to destroy things. They don't know how to create things. They don't care to even try to create things. Because if you are not going to win the hearts and the minds of the people, then of course there is no quote unquote military solution. And yet never did you have a serious conversation about something that could actually be done, including taking on the corruption of the government to do that. This is why I want to stay on the conversation about Pakistan. I know that you are the guy, you are the go-to guy who knows about nuclear issues. Pakistan has a nuclear bomb. Are these two issues related?
Well, right now, when you think about the nuclear threats we face, most people think about North Korea, which has nuclear weapons, Iran, which doesn't, but is trying to build the material that you could use to build a bomb. Very few people think about our own weapons, even though that is
7,000 or so.
With the United States and Russia together have the majority of nuclear weapons in the world. We have about 5,500. The Russians have about 6,200. So these are the things that can really destroy the world. Very few people talk about India and Pakistan. Each of those countries have 150 nuclear weapons. They have fought 4 wars since their independence with each other. They both have fundamentalist religious forces, extremists in their military and intelligence apparatus. Pakistan has a failing economy, a corrupt government, and, oh, by the way, Al-Qaeda and Taliban forces operating within their national territory. So the risk factors in Pakistan make it what I call the most dangerous country in the world. There are a whole lot of things that could go wrong that could lead to, 1, terrorists getting control of those nuclear weapons, or 2, a conflict between India and Pakistan, perhaps over the contested Kashmir region, escalating quickly into a nuclear exchange. And that would be devastating, not just for the people of South Asia, but scientists now calculate that such a war involving as few as 100 nuclear weapons, 100 weapons of the kind that India and Pakistan have, could put enough smoke and particulate into the atmosphere to shroud the Earth in cloud for 2 or 3 years, dropping global temperatures 2 or 3 degrees, leading to a nuclear winter where 40% of the crops in the world would die, leading to a famine that would probably kill 1 billion people. So you realize we have been looking at for threats in all the wrong places. You know, we think that what we got to do is hunt down ISIS in Afghanistan, and we do. But there are bigger, more problems with global implications happening next door in Pakistan that we aren't even close to tackling. So yes, we have to rearrange our national security priorities to address the real threats we face.
And the American people have actually thought that we were paying the salaries of all these people in government to be thinking about these things. Now, let me ask you a question. What has been both the reason and the application of that $1 billion a year in aid to the Pakistanis? What have we been giving them that aid for?
Well, technically, it's for military assistance and for training and to help them buy military equipment. That is U.S. military equipment.
To fight who?
The U.S. government is very delicate about this because clearly what they're using it for is to shore up their military against an Indian invasion. And the argument in Washington is that this is what you need to keep the government stable and to give them security so that they'll be more restrained in their force. But
meanwhile, they're helping to fund the Taliban.
Meanwhile, millions of this goes to the Taliban. That's exactly right. The Pakistanis have been celebrating the Taliban victory.
They won. You know, they basically, more than anyone, seems to have won this war. Okay.
Yes.
I'm sorry. You were saying?
No, that's right. Go ahead.
Okay. Can we move to China for a minute?
Sure.
We have now lost 3 wars in a row. Mm-hmm. And none of us are stupid. So it is reasonable to assume that there are many leaders in many capitals around the world who are clinking their champagne glasses. Even if they don't drink champagne, they are celebrating, they are laughing. And it is reasonable to assume that both Xi and Putin have some questions going on in their minds and in the military commanders around them, such as this might be the time to strike. They're weak. They're in trouble. The Chinese came after Hong Kong much harder and faster than anyone expected. In Xi's last major speech, he said that their patience was beginning to wear thin regarding Taiwan. We know that there's been activity in the South China Sea. Do you have any thoughts about any of this? Because it seems to me we're watching some really funky things already going on.
I think that's a possibility. But that would be a big roll of the dice. I mean, you really have to make a distinction between the failure of the counterinsurgency strategy in Iraq and Afghanistan, the horrors of our backing of the Saudi war in Yemen, with the power of the Pacific Fleet, the alliance with Japan, the alliances with Korea. The United States military is no pushover. It is still the most powerful military on the globe. A great deal of the forces are arrayed against China to prevent exactly that kind of scenario. I don't think the Chinese government is that stupid, frankly, and I think they believe the time is on their side. So I hear what they're saying. It's something to watch. But I think it's highly unlikely that the Chinese would take such a provocative step. It's a much smarter strategy for them to wait, to continue to grow their government. President Xi is more adventurous, more aggressive now than he was before, and more adventurous than the other governments before him. But I still think just looking at it from a Chinese perspective, it makes sense to wait and build up their economy and get some of the people who are now allied with us to soften those alliances through the diplomatic tools that they're now just bringing out, demonstrating, particularly with their Belt and Road initiative, and and to build up their military. I would guess that they need another decade, maybe 2 decades, to have the kind of military force that could actually allow them to do something as bold and aggressive and as massive as invade Taiwan.
I'm really
that is no
glad
small
to hear
undertaking.
That. Thank you. I'm glad to hear that, and I was sort of waiting to ask you that question. So obviously, Joe, you see the landscape for what it is. What do you think the next 6 months will bring in terms of our political and military establishment, how they transition away from this? What do you think will be the long-term consequences for the United States, for Afghanistan, and for how we operate?
I think a lot is in flux right now because of the unprecedented confluence of crises that we face: climate change, pandemics, a greater awareness of the racial injustice in our own country. Our economy is still struggling to recover from the pandemic, or a lot of uncertainties about that. And I think Joe Biden has an idea of what he wants to do. His basic frame is that he believes that the last 20 years of these wars have been a big mistake, have cost us too much, have diverted our attention, and that we are in a struggle now that has almost nothing to do with Afghanistan and Iraq, or for that matter, the Middle East. And it's a struggle between democracies and autocracies. And right now the autocracies are gaining strength, right? So
yes,
how do you
indeed.
win? He says it. He said it in his Foreign Affairs article back in January, February of last year. He says it in his speeches. You've got to show that democracy can deliver for the people. So that means you've got to shore up democratic institutions. And that for him means things like the infrastructure bill, this $3.5 billion infrastructure bill. This is his way of retooling the American economy, of retooling the role of government in American life. So that $3.5 trillion infrastructure bill, that is a big part of what I think he wants to do in reimagining national security and put the kind of money there. At the same time, I think one of the reasons the military budget is so high is they've made a very cynical calculation that this is like Keynesian economy, that the Congress is bought in on big military budgets. Why fight it? Why exert political capital now? Let's throw more money at the military. Yes, it's inefficient, but it's also a stimulus. It's also a jobs programs, very inefficient jobs programs, very cynical view. And we'll get to that later. We'll work on the military budget later. So when you ask what the next 6 months are going to be, I think we're looking at some major government expenditures. I think we're going to see Biden struggling with the pandemic. I think we're going to see a big effort, partially because of the infrastructure bill, but also in diplomacy on climate change. And this is Biden's way of sort of trying to put in place as quickly as he can, that is during his first year in office, the kind of instruments he thinks you need to begin to reimagine national security. He's going to face heavy resistance on all those fronts. So it's going to be big political infighting in Washington over these plans.
Well, I certainly agree with you about much of what you just said. And I too believe that the $3.5 trillion infrastructure bill is an effort on Biden's part to prove to the American people that democracy can work on their behalf. On the other hand, even though there are very good elements in the infrastructure bill, I fear that by the time those individual elements actually trickle down into the lives of people, even the child credit, even family leave bill, et cetera, it will not necessarily come with a big sticker that people can see that says the Democrats gave this to you. If you want that, if you want people to really see, wow, they did this for me, you raise the minimum wage. If you really want people to go, wow, Biden did that for me, you give them Medicare for all. If you really want people to say, wow, they delivered for me, you cancel the college loan debt. So that issue of, you said something that reminds me of my friend, the economist Bob Kuttner, who said something very similar to what you just said. Well, we'll do this and then we'll do the next thing. Well, you know what, Joe? If we don't win the House and the Senate in 2022, it's going to be difficult to build on any of this. So I just hope that more and more people in Washington will get out of their Beltway bubble. I understood the concept of the Beltway bubble, but until I lived here, I didn't see it as clearly as I do now. It's like they're having this conversation that's in its own kind of ivory tower. And then you look at the unbelievable chronic tension and anxiety of people who are being evicted, who had their unemployment benefits just cut off.
Yes. Yeah, I'm with you on that. I mean, on the issue I spent a good deal of my life on, the nuclear weapons issue, we have an obscene amount of money pouring into nuclear weapons we don't need that actually make us less safe, including, for example, a decision that we're about to make in the next couple of years of whether to build an entirely new intercontinental ballistic missile. This is a system that's going to cost $264 billion. We do not need it. It's completely redundant, but the whole thing is wired in from the contractors to get the support of the Armed Services Committee, to get the support of the think tank communities, to dominate the media in Washington over this. Joe Biden could have canceled that. He made a political calculation not to. I understand why he's not canceling it, but it's a huge disappointment to us. I don't frankly expect Joe Biden to make much change at all on U.S. nuclear policy. I think he's making the kind of cynical calculation you're talking about, that he can't win that battle, so why exert the capital?
I'll tell you why exert it. Two things. First of all, during my presidential campaign, I talked quite a bit about the B-21 Raiders that we were building with all this nuclear power. And I would point out to people 5 of those, and civilization as we know it is over. 10 of those drop, and the whole thing is over. What are we even talking about here? And and I think a lot of people don't realize that Obama built more. It's not like the Democrats have slowed down the process. And also, when you keep saying, you've said several times, the political calculation. I disagree with the political calculations of the Obamas and the Bidens who say, why try? Those forces won't let me. I'll tell you the answer why. So the American people can see that you're at least trying to do the right thing. So the American people can see he's on our side, even if they won't let him. So that we can see what you are trying to do. And to me, that's the ultimate political calculation, is not just what the think tanks in Washington are going to be willing to be enrolled in, but what the American people can see.
Well, I'm very glad that you're in Washington to raise these issues here, because quite honestly, we just don't have enough voices saying the kinds of things that you say, speaking these kinds of iconoclastic truths to people.
There are so many there's so many illusions of officialdom that if you just like speak some common sense, you sound like some radical out there. But at a time when so many lies are made to sound, are normalized, speaking common sense, I suppose, is a radical act, but it seems to me one that we need more of. Yeah, well, I really appreciate you, Joe. Like I said, you are the go-to man. I've always been so grateful for the clarity. I know when I first met you and the conversation about nuclear issues, when I was growing up, when you were growing up, we went to protest, ban the bomb. Now people don't even try it. The American people just like don't even think about it because it seems so overwhelming. And it's psychologically discomforting to have to think about these things because they are so dangerous. But thank you for being here. I'm going to ask you a question. Would you be kind enough that we could do in a little bit of time, and I know you must be very busy, I'd like to have a conversation with you that is specifically about nuclear issues. Would you be willing to do that with me?
I'd be happy to come back. This is an integral part of what we need to do to redefine, reimagine national security, and reorient our government expenditures so they're going towards programs that actually protect the American people and not just make a small set of corporations eat richer and richer. Thank you very much for asking me and for having me on.
Yeah, thank you very much. I wanted to really concentrate because like you and I have agreed, we must not let this Afghanistan issue go without asking the deeper questions, but I am grateful to you that you'll come back so that we can talk about nuclear issues solely. Joe Cirincione,
my pleasure.
My friends, my colleague, I'm very grateful. Thank you so much.
Thank you.